blessed memory. He conceived of the lectures as a vehicle for speakers who have enhanced Jewish literary culture in the Washington area. We've interpreted the term culture broadly over the years. Past speakers have included scholars such as Peggy Pearlstein, then head of the Hebraic section of the Library of Congress, the founders of Carbon Publishing, the then editors of Washington Jewish Week, and cookbook author and Jewish food scholar Joan Nathan. More recently, we've turned to local universities for our speakers. 3 years ago, Professor Meital Or of Georgetown University spoke on the Jewish other in Israeli Arab literature. 2 years ago, Professor Michael Brenner of American University spoke on the changing idea of a Jewish state from Herzl to Netanyahu. Last year, Professor Adi Mahalel of the University of Maryland discussed the role of the Jewish tavern in the works of Shalom Aleichem. Today, we turn to George Washington University and Professor Daniel Schwartz. His topic, based on his most recent book, is How the Ghetto Became Black. And here's the library copy of the book. My wife has our personal copy in the audience as well. Book surveys the history of the ghetto. The topic, the lecture, will survey the history of the ghetto through World War II and trace the association of the term with African Americans and the eclipse of its Jewish connotations in post-war America. Daniel Schwartz is professor of modern Jewish history, chair of the Department of History at the George Washington University. Dr. Schwartz earned his PhD in history from Columbia University in 2007 and his AB summa cum laude from Princeton in 1997. So the mathematically inclined can figure out how old he is. Professor Schwartz has been on the GW faculty since 2007, and since 2014 has directed the university's Judaic Studies program. He's the author of 3 books: The First Modern Jew, Spinoza and the History of an Image, which was co-winner of the Salo W. Barron Prize for Best First Book in Jewish Studies and a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Spinoza's Challenge to Jewish Thought, writings on his life, philosophy, and legacy, and most recently, Ghetto, the History of a Word. He specializes in modern Jewish cultural and intellectual history. He's currently working on a panoramic historical survey of the Jewish intellectual in modern times. So we'll be back in a few years to have you speak to us again. When I leaf through the acknowledgements at the end of Ghetto, I was interested to see that Professor Schwartz had a fellowship at the Library of Congress some years ago, and while there worked with Peggy Pearlstein, an earlier lecturer in our series. So, Professor Schwartz, we have more than one reason to welcome you to Bethel today, and let's begin.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here today. I should say my son this morning took my watch because he was taking the ACTs, leaving me only with my cell phone. So if I check it occasionally, I'm not, seeing who texted me, but only getting a sense of what time it is. As John mentioned, in my talk today, I'm going to focus on really what is the 5th and final chapter of the book, which looks at this kind of transfer of the term ghetto from Jews to Blacks, focusing on the post-war period. But I'm going to start with an anecdote. You can show the first slide. So one day in the 1880s, an aspiring author and recent Eastern European Jewish immigrant set out for the office of the New York Sun with an article he had written in his pocket. His name was Abraham Kahan, and the article he was carrying was a set of vignettes of life in the Jewish quarter of New York. Summoning the courage to submit the article for consideration in person, he walked into the lower Manhattan office of the Sun and was directed to the chief manuscript reader for the Sunday edition. "We'll print this next Sunday," he told the delighted Kahan, encouraging him to bring us more such copy. But when Kahan was about to leave, the editor called him back. "Pardon me," he said, "you use a word about which I must ask. What is a ghetto?" Recalling this episode in his memoirs some 40 years later in 1926, at the time by which time the would-be writer had become a giant of Yiddish journalism in America as the editor of the Jewish Vorwärts, Kahn remembered thinking at the time how ignorant American journalists were relative to their European counterparts. Was it possible for an educated man not to know this word? A more charitable interpretation would be that the term ghetto was not yet part of the American lexicon. By the 1920s, however, this unfamiliarity was a distant memory. Today, Kahn asserted confidently, every major American city has a Jewish quarter, some of them as large as a city. And every American understands the meaning of the word ghetto. He knows that it is not the part of the city in which Jews are compelled to live. That kind of ghetto does not exist. It is merely the neighborhood in which large numbers of Jews have settled. If it seemed remarkable to Kahn that 4 decades earlier, an American editor of a prestigious newspaper could have been unfamiliar with the word ghetto, it's hard to read Kahan's definition of the term without a similar sense of irony at the distance traveled. There are certainly more Americans now than a century ago who are acquainted with the word ghetto. Few, I would suspect, would define it as merely the neighborhood in which large numbers of Jews have settled. Mention ghetto today, and the images conjured are more likely to be of African-American ghettos of American cities than of the Jewish immigrant ghettos of Kahan's day, or the original mandatory ghettos of early modern Europe, or even the ghettos of the Holocaust. Once thought of primarily as a Jewish term, the word ghetto is now perceived as a Black term, first and foremost. So the story of the ghetto's migration from Jewish to Black enclaves concerns more than the shifting nuance of a particular word. Arguments about the usage, application, and even ownership of ghetto served as a stage on which were played out fundamental debates over everything from the meaning of integration and separation to the uniqueness of the Black and Jewish experiences, to the ethics of comparison. What's clear is that the conversion of the word ghetto into a term more popularly associated with Blacks than Jews was not a matter of indifference for Jews. This was so not only because it was frequently Jewish neighborhoods that were changing, or because Jews remained a presence in these neighborhoods, whether as landlords, small businessmen, teachers, social workers, or in decreasing numbers, residents. It was also because the word itself, ghetto, had become so closely bound up with images of what it meant to be Jewish. So what Maurice Samuel, writing in the Zionist periodical Midstream in 1966, aptly called the transference of the word ghetto from the Jew to the Negro, was certainly one of the most far-reaching transformations in the history of the term, yet it was hardly the first. Next slide, please. The word ghetto and its association with mandatory and exclusive Jewish space originated in Venice, when the city compelled its Jews in 1516 to move to an island on its northern limits that was already known as the Ghetto Nuovo, or the New Ghetto. This is an image of the Ghetto Nuovo from even before the mandatory Jewish enclosure was created in 1516. It's a close-up of a map from around 1501. Ghetto itself is thought to derive from the verb gettare, meaning to pour, to cast, which would evoke the copper foundries that had once occupied the site. Next slide. This is a map, maybe hard to make out in the audience here, but hopefully on Zoom. This is a map of the ghetto at its fullest extent. You can see that in the kind of pink shading, the Ghetto Nuovo. This is the main courtyard of the ghetto. I don't know how many of you have been to the Venice ghetto, but this is the main courtyard and was the original Jewish ghetto. Then below, you see this area of kind of mostly narrow streets. That's called the Ghetto Vecchio, or the Old Ghetto, which was added to the ghetto in 1541. Next slide. This is a photo of the main square of the Ghetto Nuovo. And I think what's most notable here is the sheer height of these buildings. You can see buildings that are 7 to 8, even 9 stories high. This would have been extremely unusual at the time. This kind of height would have been duplicated, to some extent exceeded only by cathedrals in the city. So something quite distinctive, although you see the kind of the building of tenements necessary in order to house all these Jews in such a small space. What started as the name for one specific place where Jews were forced to live became, over the 16th century, the principal term for mandatory and exclusive Jewish quarters throughout Italy. Next slide, please. Oh, that went backward. Oh, this is a street in the Ghetto Vecchio. You can see how narrow it is. Go next slide, please. This is the ghetto in Rome was founded by Pope Paul IV, probably one of the most anti-Jewish popes in Jewish history, in 1555. And what's striking about the ghetto of Rome is that it was created pretty much smack dab in the middle of the city, as opposed to the Venetian ghetto, which is kind of on the northern outskirts. This was basically a mile away from the Vatican across the Tiber River. Next slide. And this shows you a map from 1777, the yellow shading of what was then the boundaries of the ghetto. Next slide. It's a little hard, I'm sure it's hard to make out from the audience. This was a street, this here is called Piazza Judea. It was like the Judean square. This area itself was not part of the ghetto. However, if you look at the bottom right, you can see a gate which was leading into the ghetto. Next slide, please. One of the requirements, or the restrictions, I should say, that the Pope placed in the ghetto was that there was be only one synagogue. So, but there were multiple, Jewish congregations, typically, from different ethnic Jewries, different rites. And so what they created was this synagogue called the Cinque Scuole, or the 5 synagogues, that were basically built into one building as a way of trying to circumvent this particular law. So it's only really in the 19th century that the word ghetto begins to break free of its Italian origins and to substitute for it, even displace native terms for the Jewish street or Jewish quarter in other languages. Well, no, it's okay, we can skip over. While also emerging as a critical frame for conceptualizing Jewish modernity. In other words, at the very moment the ghetto as a historical institution appeared to be everywhere in retreat as Jews throughout the West were being emancipated, the word ghetto gained a centrality in the Jewish cultural lexicon that paradoxically had never enjoyed in the so-called age of ghettos, when ghettos were found throughout Italy and also in Central Europe. This is a kind of painting of the ghetto from actually after the ghetto was legally dismantled in 1870. But you can still see something of what the conditions of the ghetto were like. Ultimately in Rome, the ghetto was basically knocked down as part of a major urban renewal project in the 1890s. This is why if you visit Rome today, you can see glimpses of what were the Jewish ghetto, but only really very small glimpses, as opposed to if you go to Venice and you can see the ghetto more or less as it existed. So what happens is more than simply a place. Ghetto in the 19th century became the ultimate metaphor for pre-modern Jewish life. It was a term that now evoked a whole complex of values, norms, beliefs, folkways, and social types believed to be disappearing. Next slide. So this brings us to a new incarnation of the term ghetto, when the word ghetto came to be applied to these immigrant enclaves caused by mass immigration out of Eastern Europe, in cities in Western and Central Europe, but also in the United States. This is how the ghetto comes to America. This is a street scene from the Lower East Side. It's actually Hester Street, which was one of the main thoroughfares of the Lower East Side. And it's I'm sure very hard to make out, but in the bottom right corner, you can see this postcard identified as the ghetto, New York City, or next slide. This was a kind of colorful map of Manhattan from 1926. And this is just a small detail of the map. You can see the area north of Delancey is identified as the ghetto, even though the Lower East Side really extended south of Delancey Street as well, but they had, I guess, to place it somewhere. So you have the immigrant ghetto, which was essentially a voluntary space, right? Jews were not, dispatched to the Lower East Side from Castle Garden or Ellis Island immediately upon arrival. I'm not saying that there weren't, certain factors that led them to congregate there, but it was not a legal ghetto. But then you saw the revival of the legal institution of the ghetto under the Nazis. Next slide, please. So what's interesting is that in many ways, both the immigrant ghetto and the Nazi ghetto were seen as way stations. The immigrant ghetto was seen as a kind of transitory measure that was kind of where you traveled through while moving from the old world to the new world. It was kind of a space where you began to acculturate and assimilate before you were ready to move out. So the Nazi ghetto was also seen as a kind of way station, as a transitory measure, as you can see here in this memo creating the Lodge ghetto in late 1939, saying it was only a transitional measure. This is perhaps the only similarity between the Nazi ghetto and the immigrant ghetto, because it really reversed the trajectory of the immigrant ghetto entirely. It was a place whose arrow appeared to point backward, not forward in time. And I say appeared because the destruction of European Jewry that followed was without precedent. The only similarity between the two was that both were conceived as temporary phenomena. The way station would come to serve as the operative metaphor for the Nazi ghetto as well, but only as a stop en route to genocide. In practice, the Nazi ghetto served as a prelude to deportation to the killing fields and eventually the death camps. And they thus gave rise to an altogether different sense in which ghettoization was a stage not of assimilation, but annihilation. And just the next slide, I'll show you a few images. This was the Lodge ghetto, one of the earliest ghettos to be established in early 1940. Next slide. This is a photo from the gates of the Lodge ghetto. And one of the things you see is that the Nazis often used euphemisms to refer to the ghetto. So here it's called Wohngebiet der Juden, like living area, of the Jews, betreten verboten, meaning entry is forbidden. Next slide. This is a Nazi map of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was created in October of 1940. Jews constituted some 30% of the population of interwar Warsaw. And the numbers of Jews in Warsaw only climbed in 1939 to 1940 as Jews were basically being forced out of nearby cities. And yet they were stuck in an area of roughly 1.2 square miles with an average of about 7.2 persons to a room. Next slide. Here you see the building of the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. So next slide. So just to kind of summarize this kind of like mini history I've provided of the word ghetto through the 1940s. We have the idea of the Ghetto Nuovo of Venice. Ghetto here is a proper name. Then ghetto emerging as a kind of generic word for the idea of a mandatory exclusive Jewish urban neighborhood in Italy. Then ghetto is a globalized Jewish term for Jewish street or quarter that was not necessarily compulsory or exclusive. Ghetto is a metaphor for pre-modern Jewish society, and then the immigrant ghetto, and then the Holocaust ghetto. So you can see that before we even begin to really speak in earnest about the transfer of the term from Jews to Blacks, this is already very much a multi-layered term with different insinuations, different implications, so that the potential for finding common ground on certain uses of the word while drawing a line at others was there from the start. So the conversion of ghetto into a term more commonly associated with Blacks than with Jews began in the 1960s. Digital history resources allow us to plot trends in the usage of a word with an exactitude that years ago would have been unthinkable. So next slide, and I'm sure here you won't be able to see it, it's too, but there was a general surge in the use of ghetto in the 1960s. That's if you can see this sharp turn upward. This is the word ghetto in the 1960s that crested in the early 1970s. From 1960 to 1965, phrases like Negro ghetto or Black ghetto began to surpass Jewish ghetto in popular usage, though Negro ghetto plateaued and then fell below Jewish ghetto in the mid-1970s as the term Negro came to be regarded as offensive and unfashionable. And that's the next slide, which will be even more difficult to read, but it shows the different curves of the use of Jewish, Negro, and Black ghetto. Okay, next slide. The change was so dramatic that it seemed to many as if the contemporary Black referent for the term was a complete novelty. Is there actually such a thing as an American ghetto? An August 1967 column in the US News and World Report asked, just as the worst spate of urban racial violence in American history seemed finally to be ebbing. Or is this a propaganda word used for a purpose? The column continued, a few years ago, somebody conceived the idea of applying the word ghetto to Negro neighborhoods in the United States. Used in this way, the word gives an impression of an oppressed people, restricted by law, compelled to live in a certain area. A look at the facts, however, shows that the Negro neighborhoods of today do not have the true characteristics of a ghetto. Now, US News was the most conservative of the three major American news weeklies, and its skepticism was echoed by several other right-wing outlets and op-ed columnists who opposed what was seen as an attempt to besmirch America's reputation by identifying it with a word and concept as allegedly un-American as the ghetto. Next slide. Yet if its resistance to the term ghetto reflected a particular segment of public opinion, its perception that there was something new and even jarring about its application to Black neighborhoods seems to have been broadly shared. In the same month as the US News article appeared, August 1967, the Black magazine Ebony ran a piece entitled "I'll Never Escape the Ghetto" by Stanley Sanders, a Black Rhodes Scholar and native of Watts in LA. Sanders recalled how different things had been 8 years earlier when he left home for college, back when he thought that fleeing Watts was both possible and desirable. He wrote, "Negro college youth during those undergraduate years had none of its present mood. Good grades, athletics, popularity. These were the things that mattered. The word ghetto had not even entered the lexicon of race relations. People were not conscious of the ghetto as a separate phenomenon." In fact, uses of the word ghetto with reference to the segregation of Black Americans reached back much further than the 1960s. In 1910, Baltimore became the first city to pass a municipal zoning ordinance that divided every street into Black and white blocks. Its example was soon copied by other cities throughout the South and Midwest, including Richmond, Atlanta, New Orleans, Oklahoma City, St. Louis, and Louisville. The growing trend of residential segregation by law galvanized African-American newspapers throughout the United States, and stopping it became the overriding mission of the newly founded NAACP. In 1917, the Supreme Court found Baltimore-style ordinances unconstitutional, bringing a stop to the effort to introduce statutory ghettos in American cities, while doing little to stem the hemming in of African Americans in practice. It was in the context of the struggle against the gathering movement to extend Jim Crow to city neighborhoods that the word ghetto began to appear with growing frequency in African American newspapers and periodicals. Do you really want the Negro ghetto established here in the capital of the nation? Asked a November 1913 letter in the Washington Bee, appealing for support for the NAACP. A ghetto like that already established a few miles away in Baltimore. A ghetto where the law and courts of justice compel you and your families to live herded together and apart from the rest of humanity as though your color were the plague. On occasion, we find uses of ghetto in this period that prefigure how charged the term would later become in Black-Jewish relations, as in this March 1917 letter that appeared in the radical St. Paul-based Black newspaper, The Appeal, lambasting Joel Spingarn, then chairman of the NAACP, for supporting a military training camp for Blacks. It said Spingarn, the Jew, is classed as a white man here in the United States. There is no Jewish problem here. Now that he is out of Russia from whence he came, leaving the ghetto behind, he is willing to put the colored man in the ghetto here. Next slide. But the most noteworthy and repeated example of the use of ghetto in the early 20th century Black press could be found in the pages of The Crisis, the official journal of the NAACP, founded and edited in the early years, largely written by W.E.B. Du Bois. Starting in December 1910, in the second number of the first volume, a regular column entitled The Ghetto, written almost certainly by Du Bois, in spite of the anonymous authorship, appeared in most editions of The Crisis. Most simply reported on the latest developments around the nation in the efforts to impose residential segregation by law. And indeed, December 1910, when the column debuted, was the month the Baltimore Ordinance was passed. In the following decades, as racial restrictive covenants, realtor steering, and redlining, not to mention physical violence, only hardened the color line in housing, the word ghetto became an increasingly central term in the Black lexicon for describing residential segregation by race, even as the concept continued to be primarily associated with Jews. In the aftermath of World War II, American Black and Jewish organizations jointly waged a mostly successful legal fight against one of the chief pillars of residential segregation, racial restrictive covenants. And the word ghetto, with all its recent Nazi overtones, was a crucial part of their arsenal. Next slide. Oh, good. So this shows you an example of a racial restrictive covenant where it says basically that no property in this said edition should be either sold or rented to anyone not of the Caucasian race. So this was focusing on Blacks and Asian Americans specifically, not on Jews, but we'll see there were others focused on Jews as well. Homes for Aryans Only ran the title to the first of a series of articles against covenants in Commentary magazine in the late 1940s. Its author, housing expert Charles Abrams, warned the involuntary ghetto may soon become an unalterable American institution. Next slide. In 1948, the National Committee on Segregation in the nation's capital issued a report, Segregation in Washington, which included a chapter on housing segregation entitled Ghettos in the Capital. Ghetto is an ugly word, the chapter opened. To a Dane, it is ugly. To any Nazi victim, to anyone who saw how Hitler placed a yellow mark on Jews so that they could be made to live apart, suffer apart, die apart. To an American, it is ugly. Nevertheless, the report went on, in the capital of the nation live 250,000 people, 1/4 of the city, who need no mark sewed on their clothing. Let there be any color in the skin identifiable as Negro, half Negro, or 1/8 Negro, and the possessor of that skin has lost his American right to live anywhere in town. Robert Weaver, a Washington native who was one of the organizers of the committee that issued segregation in Washington, published that same year a book called The Negro Ghetto, which was the first book that was a detailed history of residential segregation in the North, and the first to feature the word ghetto with a Black referent in its title. Robert Weaver, interestingly, was also the first Black ever nominated to a cabinet post. Under the Johnson administration, he was named the head of what was then the newly founded Agency for Housing and Urban Development. The book appeared at roughly the same time that the Supreme Court, in the 1948 case Shelley versus Kramer, banned judicial enforcement of restrictive covenants. 4 American Jewish organizations filed a joint amicus brief in the case, arguing that the court should find such covenants unconstitutional. Acknowledging Negroes have suffered most from the widespread use of restrictive covenants, the brief cited a recent case in Bethesda, no less, involving a covenant against Jews, in which a group of homeowners had asked a Maryland court to order the non-Jewish wife to oust her Jewish husband from their home. The organizations sponsoring this brief, it continued, are peculiarly alert to the dangers to democracy arising from racial or religious residential segregation. Jewish experience under European despotism gave rise to the word ghetto. The threat of revival of that institution, implicit in the mushroom growth in almost every American city of racial restrictive covenants, demands intercession in these cases. So the battle against restrictive covenants appears in hindsight to have been a crucial landmark in the transference of the ghetto concept. To be sure, Blacks were the main target of such covenants from their inception. And even before the judiciary washed its hands of them, the suburbanization of the Jews had begun in earnest. Still, in 1948, it was at least possible for American Jews to invoke the word ghetto to convey a shared, if less significant, experience of housing discrimination in the present. For Blacks, the demise of legally enforceable covenants was mostly impotent in the face of the physical violence and systematic redlining that continued to restrict their residential options. For Jews, however, it lifted the main surviving structural obstacle to moving into leafy neighborhoods previously off limits to them. And now I'm going to skip over a part of this about the suburbanization, the mass suburbanization of Jews starting in the 1940s, lasting into the 1960s. And how this led to a major divide between Blacks and Jews. To the point that you can, next slide, we'll skip over the next slide. We'll skip over that. So in 1961, Rabbi Simon Glustrom explained in his book, Living with Your Teenager, a guide for Jewish parents, he said, Jewish children of today don't even understand the meaning of the word ghetto unless it has been explained to them in a particular historical setting. 6 years later, in the periodical Judaism, Richard Fine suggested that the children of today probably would understand the word ghetto, only in an altogether different setting. How ironic, he mused, that word ghetto, from Italian, for centuries a word coined for where we would live, and now for them, is slipping past the moorings of our immediate consciousness and instant concern. There must be a new generation of American Jews growing up to whom the word ghetto is instinctively connected with Negro, not Jew. The widening in the post-war years of what was already in 1948 a substantial social and economic divide between Jews and Blacks changed the tenor of the ghetto analogy. American Jewish activists and organizations still drew on the ghetto experience to mobilize Jewish commitment to civil rights and forge common ground with Blacks. In September 1963, only a few weeks after his memorable speech at the March on Washington, the Newark Reform rabbi and president of the American Jewish Congress, Joachim Prince, reminded American Jews that the word ghetto, often used to describe segregated Negro neighborhoods, is a part of Jewish history. The key word here was history, a history that was both centuries old and incredibly recent. So recent that the line between past and present was frequently blurred, not least for the refugees and survivors themselves. Still, even appeals that drew on this present past to generate support for civil rights could not escape the fact that for the ghetto to serve as a bridge between peoples, it also had to be a bridge across time. Time, in fact, was at the heart of what made the transference of the word ghetto so charged. For the debate over whether the term was a good fit for the geography of Black America centered on an interpretation not only of ghetto space, but of ghetto time. Underlying practically all of the controversies about the American city, Irving Kristol wrote in the New York Times in 1966, there lies the question: can the Negro be expected to follow the path of previous immigrant groups, or is his a special pathological case? The word ghetto had for a time been pressed into service to forge a connection between the experiences of previous migrant groups and the expectation for future ones. Even after the Holocaust, this resonance endured. In his 1951 book, The Uprooted, Oscar Handlin, the Harvard professor and American Jew, who's basically the dean of American immigration historians, depicted settlement in the ghettos quite literally as a chapter in the generic immigrant narrative. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Handlin became one of the foremost spokesmen of those who believed that the latest newcomers to the American metropolis, the Negroes and Puerto Ricans, were following in the footsteps of their foreign-born precursors, and that the problems of their segregated enclaves differed in degree, but not in kind, from those of yesteryear. By the 60s, however, ghetto had more or less ceased to convey a phase common to all, signifying instead a prison imposed upon one. It was not the beginning or middle of a migration story, but seemingly its end. Go back one slide, please. Kenneth Clark, in his 1965 book, Dark Ghetto, which probably did more than any other individual work to connect ghetto and Black in the mainstream media, introduced the contemporary American ghetto as the successor to the Jewish quarter of 16th century Venice and to other sections of cities where Jews were forcibly confined. What America had contributed to the concept of the ghetto, he famously argued, was the restriction of persons to a certain area and the limiting of their freedom of choice on the basis of color, a far cry from the earlier view of the American ghetto as a site where alienation gradually gave rise to assimilation. If Clark, next slide, reached back to the early modern ghetto for a prototype, others more controversially looked to much more recent history for models. In his blistering 1967 essay, Negroes are anti-Semitic because they are anti-white, James Baldwin fingered the dismissal of comparisons between Watts and Harlem and the Warsaw Ghetto by Jews and whites, or for Baldwin, Jews as whites, as a factor in Black anti-Semitism. The uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto was not described as a riot, he complained, nor were the participants maligned as hoodlums. The boys and girls in Watts and Harlem are thoroughly aware of this, and it certainly contributes to their attitude toward the Jews. The issue, it seemed, was not whether analogies for the Black ghetto per se were legitimate, but which ones. Why don't we skip over the next two slides? I want to show just an example of some blowback from American Jews at the Black appropriation of the word ghetto. This is, we'll go back one slide. This is from an article that Marie Sirkin, who was a Jewish intellectual, professor at Brandeis, and a Zionist, a prominent American Zionist, from an article she wrote in September 1964, amid the first of the New York public school crises that would roil the city in the 1960s. Sirkin sought to restore a distinction between legal and de facto segregation that she saw as being fudged by the civil rights movement. The issue of the word ghetto arose in this context. The term ghetto, Sirkin pointed out, now often prefixed with the adjective black, has a specific Jewish origin. It means literally a quarter to which Jews were restricted by law. Recognizing, moreover, that any point of view which runs counter in any significant respect to the current Negro civil rights program is bound to be suspect, she claimed to be writing not as a white liberal, though I believe the label fits, but as a member of a minority which knows more about systematic discrimination and violent persecution than any group in history. And then the clincher. In the immediate as well as historic experience of the Jews, the ghetto is not a metaphor. It is a concrete entity with walls, stormtroopers, and no exit save the gas chamber. So kind of real ratcheting up of the rhetoric here. Now, next slide. With the passing of time, what Jewish resistance there was to the changing application of the word ghetto ebbed, but not entirely, especially when memory of the Holocaust was at stake. Nearly 30 years ago now, on the eve of the gala opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the American Jewish author Melvin Jules Buquet published an editorial in the Washington Post entitled "The Museum versus Memory, the Taming of the Holocaust." Buquet was bitingly critical of the museum, which he judged a well-intentioned but insidious attempt to absorb the Holocaust melting pot into a vocabulary of American politics and culture and sap it of its Jewish specificity. Something similar, Buquet wrote, has also begun to happen with other elements of the Jewish tradition. Take the word ghetto, which is commonly used as a synonym for slum. A ghetto is an enclosed, preferably walled-in domain within a city. And despite the invisible walls around Harlem, there is no barbed wire across 125th Street, and there are no guard towers. The second part of the historical definition of the word ghetto is that its residents must be Jews. There's an iconography to Jewish history that encourages others covetous of its passion to try to appropriate its imagery. Buquet's target here is obviously the notion of ghetto as Black, not Jewish. But to come full circle, it's also striking how his definition of ghetto deviates from the one Abraham Kahan offered almost 100 years ago, before the rise of Holocaust ghettos and Black ghettos. Today, Kahan declared in 1926, as emphatically as Buquet did decades later, every American understands the meaning of the word ghetto. He knows that it is not a part of the city in which Jews are compelled to live. That kind of ghetto does not exist. It is merely the neighborhood in which large numbers of Jews have settled. We seem to be back at the question Kahan's editor at the New York Sun posed in the 1880s, the one Kahan dismissed as ignorant, but in hindsight appears anything but. What is a ghetto? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. We now have an opportunity for questions and answers. I will be monitoring the chat to see if anybody on Zoom wants to pose a question. If anyone wants to pose a question from the live audience, I invite you to do so. And if you even are willing to come up and speak at this microphone, that would make it obviate the necessity for repeating the questions. So is anyone, then who would like to begin? If you don't begin, I'm sorry, were you raising your hand? Okay, I will begin. Yeah, so I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on sort of the discourse between Black and Jewish communities on the subject of the term ghetto and how it is to be interpreted. And I will, I appreciate that in the interest of time, we slid over a couple of slides, but I just call people's attention. I've been screen shared here, so I don't think I can bring it back up. But there was I guess a Seder sponsored by the
Yes.
and I guess that was Arthur Waskow.
Yes. Yes. If you, yes.
Talk a little bit about
Sure.
that and attempts to sort of come to some kind of a common understanding, or at least whatever. I don't want to use the term truce, but some amicable understanding of the alternative interpretation.
Yeah. So in the interest of time, I focused on kind of like Jewish kind of rejections of this African-American appropriation of the term, but there were American Jews who reacted to this in many ways quite differently. So, I mean, just to give an example, this magazine, Jewish Currents, which has been revived today as a kind of staunchly anti-Zionist left-wing publication, but it also existed as a far left newspaper and in initial incarnation as communist newspaper or magazine in the 50s and 60s. So I'll just read you a quote from Jewish Currents in 1969, where the once blacklisted screenwriter Albert Maltz, so he was a communist, wrote, "During the lifetime of many of us, the word ghetto has changed its meaning. Once, of course, it meant that part of the city in which Jews were confined by law or by anti-Semitic devices and pressures. Today in our country, there are no ghettos for Jews, but there are for Black citizens, areas in which they are confined by poverty and by the varied pressures and devices of white racism. Any Jew," he went on to say, "who did not commit himself wholeheartedly to combating the racism that had created these ghettos automatically spits on the past struggles and sufferings of his own people and is kin to the SS guards at Auschwitz." So a little bit of overkill on the other side, as well. But in terms of what John is mentioning, in 1969, there was an organization that existed that was founded in the 1960s in DC called DC Jews for Urban Justice, which was a left-wing group that was kind of working very hard, was kind of, first of all, very critical of the Jewish establishment, and was trying to forge connections with African Americans at a time when this kind of Black-Jewish alliance is beginning to fray. And so in 1969, in DC, in Columbia Heights, there was this so-called Freedom Seder that brought Jews and Blacks together. You actually can see a clip of it, like a 10-minute clip of it on YouTube from 1969. You'll see a young Arthur Waskow, then probably in his late 30s, who was the driving force behind this, and who also wrote a special Haggadah for the occasion, which was called the Freedom Haggadah. And it was steeped in the language of the anti-war movement and Black militancy. And so in the ritual of the spilling of the wine, Waskow developed a whole chain of tradition of violent revolts in the struggle for freedom, so that you would have an excerpt from Emanuel Ringelblum's Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the most famous diaries from the Warsaw Ghetto, followed almost immediately by a selection from the Black Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. So, on the left, you see a very different attempt to really say, no, I mean, this term belongs to you too. In some ways, maybe even belongs more to you now, as this Albert Maltz is saying, but they're doing so as a way of trying to conserve a certain solidarity between Jews and Blacks. So, there were various perspectives. Obviously, ghetto is a term that has a largely pejorative association. So there were some people, Jews, who were, happy to bid it farewell to the extent they could. But as you saw, also there were some people who felt that this is part of Jewish history, and that by using it for other people, it's kind of almost like raiding Jewish history for its keywords, right? In the same way we've seen other keywords that have been appropriated, diaspora, right? Which they've, diaspora studies in universities rarely focuses on Jews, mainly on, other diaspora groups. So yeah, and ghetto was seen kind of as one of these terms.
So being a Jew from New York City, I've always been fascinated by some of the history of the different massive migration surges of Jews, especially to the Lower East Side. And besides, obviously, cultural issues as far as wanting to be part of a
Right.
community, were there any sort of restrictions in place at the time in New York or other cities in the United States as far as where Jews could go to live? And were there similar rental restrictions for like Blacks moving up to Harlem or other areas that now where there are congregations of different ethnic groups?
Right. Well, I mean, I think, one of the main limitations, just moving anywhere, I mean, this is still before you really have racial restrictive covenants that have been created in earnest. But, part of it was simply a factor of class, right? I mean, Jews often arrived in this country, with very little to their name. And I mean, and you're arriving off the boat. You don't necessarily know any English. You're looking for a job, right? I mean, the barriers to entry for a job on the Lower East Side are much lower. I mean, because this garment industry is essentially run by Jews. So you can start, at the bottom, and you can work your way up to become a contractor, a subcontractor, even maybe eventually a manufacturer, a retailer. So, the Lower East Side was not the only kind of like Jewish neighborhood / ghetto. I mean, another area that emerged in the late 19th century as a very densely populated Jewish neighborhood, in some ways even more densely populated for a time than Lower East Side, was Brownsville in Brooklyn. And Jews then begin moving to other places, like Harlem was a Jewish neighborhood, in the early decades of the 20th century, before it became a largely Black neighborhood. You can go on a tour in Harlem today and see, churches that used to be synagogues. And then eventually Jews move out to areas of kind of what are called second settlement, but which also were very densely Jewish. I mean, parts of Brooklyn, like Midwood, Brooklyn, Flatbush, Brooklyn, Williamsburg, the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, eventually to areas that, this term gilded ghetto came to be used to refer to like areas like the Upper West Side, as Jews began to move in there in the 1920s and 1930s. And that term often accompanied them to the suburbs as well. I was going to talk about that more, but I just, in the interest of having more time for Q&A, I skipped over it.
Okay, so we have someone on Zoom, Herb Tannenbaum, who I think would like to ask a question in a different way. Herb, if you can hear me and if you can unmute yourself, we'd be delighted to hear your question.
I grew up in Washington, D.C., and as a kid or as a Jew, you could not own a home in Upper Massachusetts Avenue. You could not own a home over here in Kenwood, where the cherry blossoms. You had to, and we used the word covenant more than the word govern. And I have a copy of the covenant. There was a beach place out on the bay known as Beverly Beach. There was a sign there saying, "No Jews, dogs, and niggers allowed." Now, we didn't call them, it was all, you had to agree to send it back to WCNA Miller. which is a local company, if you bought a home up there. So it had the same
Yes.
reputation, but we called them covenants. And I was wondering,
Yes.
what's the difference between a covenant and a ghetto?
Yeah, I actually was going to show one slide that, I mean, there's some very interesting website that is kind of like what's called Mapping Segregation in Washington, DC. And you can see basically in DC where there used to be residential covenants applied, whether by petition or by deed, as I showed here in the example here, where it's actually part of the deed to the house. What I was going to show is the upper, that tip of DC where I live, in Shepherd Park. I don't know if any of you, familiar with that neighborhood. Shepherd Park was an area that was covenanted, and through 1948, through the 50s, there were really no Jews lived there. Jews lived primarily in Southwest DC, and what you begin to see in the 1950s and 1960s is Jews begin to move into neighborhoods like Shepherd Park en masse. This is how you have, for those of you familiar with the synagogue architecture of Upper 16th Street, you have these like massive mid-century synagogues, Tifereth Israel and Ohef Shalom, they're right across the street from one another. And there was another one that's close to the block where I live called Beth Shalom. So that's the only of those three. That's the only congregation that doesn't still exist in that place. It's now an Ethiopian church. The congregation moved out to Potomac. But yes, this became a heavily Jewish neighborhood. And what's interesting about Shepherd Park is that when African Americans begin moving in as well, there were attempts to prevent the same kind of white flight or Jewish flight as you saw in many other neighborhoods around the country. There's a great man named Marvin Kaplan, who created an organization called Neighbors, Inc. That worked very hard to try to keep the neighborhood more integrated than many other neighborhoods have become. I'm not saying, it did become, majority African-American. Although even now that's beginning to, Jews have moved in great numbers in the last 20 years. So yes, you're absolutely right. There were many parts of DC that were covenanted and where Jews were not allowed to live. And certainly African-Americans were not allowed to live.
So we're almost out of time. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to put in two quick observations about other aspects of segregation in the Washington area. And then I'm going to call your attention to two comments from the chat that you might want to react to. And then if there aren't any other questions after that, then we're going to finish up. So I was interested to hear you use the term gilded ghetto, because I grew up in the Bethesda area. And when I was a kid, Mr. Tannenbaum mentioned Kenwood is a place where Jews couldn't go. So there's a place called Kenwood Park adjacent to it that was always known as the Golden Ghetto among people such as myself, because that's where the somewhat wealthier than my family Jewish families lived. And then the other thing, you mentioned Columbia Heights. It reminded me, I'm sure people in ODC know, in Columbia Heights, crossing 14th Street, there's a street called Park Road. And historically, I don't know whether it was legally, but historically, that was the place north of which Chinese people, Oriental people couldn't live.
Right.
So that's just another example of the de jure or de facto dividing lines. Now, two points, really mostly, I guess, having to do with terminology, but since people put them in there, I'd like to mention them. So someone reminded us that along with ghetto, there's now the term hood, short for neighborhood, that in a way has a similar connotation. I mean, you might, if you're willing, take a moment to sort of comment on to what extent they really overlap and to what extent they're different. And then there was just another comment, I'm not really sure what's to be said about it, the use of the term genealogy as opposed to history, discussing this. So those are kind of the last two items on the to-do list, and I'll leave it for you to handle in any way that you wish.
I mean, look, I think one of the things you've seen happen with the word ghetto in the last 20, 25 years is that its colloquial usage has expanded dramatically. People will say phrases like, "Oh, that's so ghetto," which, is a pretty derisive, phrase, which kind of implies something is inferior, something second rate, something cheap. But you also see the other side where it's like ghetto, this whole idea of ghetto fabulous, which is like very flamboyant. There still is a kind of negative insinuation there. So, I mean, there are people, there have been controversies about the word ghetto, about, people applying this term to Black neighborhoods because it's seen as pathologizing them. And that continues into the present. The term ghetto is widespread within, hip hop. I discussed this a little bit in the conclusion to my book. So I would say, hood and ghetto have pretty, similar implications. But, I read an article where someone claimed like the ghetto has become like the new N-word. Maybe, that's a little bit of a stretch, but it's seen as, kind of calling a place Black in a negative way. Now, in answering that question, I forgot the other question. What was it?
So there was
Oh, genealogy. Yes. Obviously, this term genealogy can be used in many ways. Like I think the popular understanding, I'm sure, when you think about genealogy, is like doing, genealogical research about your family history, about your ancestry. When I use it, even though, this book is called The History of a Word, it's not called The Genealogy of a Word, but basically I see myself as kind of tracing its usage and evolution and kind of inflection in particular moments of time. Obviously, you're not going to write a history that covers everything. But what I tried to do was to kind of home in on moments where the term kind of is inflected in a certain way. It attains a different type of significance. And so the genealogy also looks at the way in which, these layers build on each other. And sometimes maybe cause earlier layers to fade out, but sometimes those layers are there to, rear their head again. So that's kind of how I'm using genealogy. More of like kind of trying to understand the pedigree and the lineage of the term.
Thanks very much. Well, I think we're actually a few minutes past time, but I feel like it's definitely worth it. I hope that people on Zoom felt that they had a reasonably plugged in experience here, and I'm delighted that we actually had 15 or at least 15 people here in person. That was maybe under 1/3 of the total audience, but thank you for handling it very, very smoothly. And there's a lot more questions that could be asked and things that could be said. And as you alluded to, in a way, it's especially appropriate to be discussing this topic now, 2 weeks before Pesach, because historically there certainly have been these analogies, and the whole question of the strength of those analogies and what there's a call to do about them today, and it's extremely timely. The book is called Ghetto: The History of a Word by Professor Daniel Schwartz. It's available quite conveniently from the Harvard University Press website. Of course, there are other places where one could purchase it as well. But I will highlight the Harvard University Press website. And with that, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's speaker. They said there's a whole lot more that we could